Everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Nicole Alifanti. I'm one of the founders and the president of CURE, the Coalition for Understanding Racism Through Education. We are a volunteer nonprofit dedicated to creating space that is consistently, relentlessly offering education about systemic racism in America and how we can heal our country and create equity starting in our own county. Shout out of gratitude to the leaders in CURE today who have helped make this happen. Pam Brandman, Ann Lobu, Ann Matola, Conan Sheth, Gabrielle Blumberg. It's an honor to work with you. CURE would like to express our gratitude to the Westchester County Board of Legislators and Catherine Parker, who have been supporting our work for years. This is our second annual 5 Towns, 1 Book event, and we thank them for their support. This year, once again, we partnered with the 5 libraries of New Rochelle, Harrison, Rye, Larchmont, and Mamaroneck. We want to thank Tom Giaffino, the head librarian here today at the beautiful New Rochelle Library in this gorgeous Ossie Davis Theater, and his team. And then with support from Terry Kirshner at the Westchester Library System, we added 20 additional county libraries that put out programs based on the truth, racial healing, and transformation resources that are mentioned in Ms. McGhee's book that we're going to discuss today. Our other partners are the Human Rights Commission and LMC Media, who are filming today, and 40 other Westchester organizations that were displayed on the screen earlier. Outside, we have Miss Otelia Taylor Tanner. She's a bespoke bookseller of the Humble Bumble book. She's selling copies of The Sum of Us by Miss McGhee in the lobby, and it's a great gift for Mother's Day and Father's Day coming up. So purchase one outside, and please look at her other beautifully curated books. So I wanted to introduce our moderators. We are very, very thankful for their generosity for coming here today and for speaking with Miss Heather McGhee. I can't go through their bios in person, so we printed them up for you because they're extensive. But we have Nicole Benjamin, Reverend Tammy Burks. Nicole is a JD at the city, where she earned her JD at the City University School of Law. She's a licensed master social worker and civic leader. Reverend Tammy Burks is the priest at St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Mamaroneck. Durandi Martinez right here is the executive director of Community Resource Center in Mamaroneck. And Shane Ocean-Loyer is the founder and president of Urban Legacy. So I just want to take a moment to read a beautiful quote from Miss McGhee's book, because sitting with this truth about who we are and wanting to dismantle it is the reason that CURE was founded. So this is from The Sum of Us. Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But we know that progress is not guaranteed. When the arc in America bends from slavery in the 1860s and returns to convict leasing in the 1880s, when it bends from Jim Crow in the 1960s and returns to mass incarceration in the 1970s, when it bends from indigenous genocide to an epidemic of indigenous suicides, when it bends, but as a tree does in the wind, only to sway back, we have to admit that we have not touched the root. We have not touched the root because the laws we make are expressions of a root belief, and it is time to face our most deep-seated one. The great lie that at the root of our nation's founding was a belief in the hierarchy of human value, and we are still there. Heather McGhee is an expert in economic and social policy, the former president of inequality-focused think tank Demos. Ms. McGhee has drafted legislation, testified before Congress, and contributed regularly to news programs, including NBC's Meet the Press. She now chairs the board of The Color of Change, the nation's largest online justice organization. Ms. McGhee holds a BA in American Studies from Yale University and a JD from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. And now it is my true honor to introduce Heather McGhee, author of The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Let me just make sure that she hears us. Oh, there she is. Yay. Thank you for beaming in today.
Hi, everybody.
I'm just going to start with one quick question, and then I'm going to exit the stage and leave it to our moderators. Just for folks who have not read your book, Miss McGhee, can you give us a brief overview? Thank you.
Yeah, I would be happy to. And first, if I may, I want to take this moment to say a whole bunch of thank yous. I'm sure I'm going to miss some people, but please know that my heart is very full at this moment to be part of this conversation. Thank you to Nicole for that beautiful introduction, for founding CURE with its really essential mission of addressing racism through education and being able to understand who we are as human beings and who we are to one another, to create these kinds of public programmings in partnership with my hands down favorite public good that the good people of the society have ever created, which is American libraries, to so many of them, the 5 and then the 20 more who incorporated the truth, racial healing, and transformation framework to create community conversations. It's just really overwhelming. When I set out to write the book, one of my dreams was that more than any white paper that I ever wrote for Demos or any legislative testimony that I ever gave in a hall of Congress, that I could write something that would get inside people, that would touch them, that would create a catalyst for conversations, and that most importantly would be read together. I believe strongly and powerfully in the incredible impact that can come from collective action, from people reading together, discussing together, making plans together, seeing their communities differently, forging bonds that are beyond the sort of day-to-day, that really come from addressing head-on the core questions of who we are to one another. And it just is overwhelming and fills my heart that because of CURE and this incredible initiative that is happening not too far from where I live in Westchester County, and then today on the Zoom with lots of other people across the country who are taking part of this conversation. So thank you all so much. Thank you to the moderators today. Thank you to the moderators of the community-based and library conversations. I'm just really, really touched and pleased to be a part of this today. Oh, and what's my book about? Okay, that too. I really wrote my book out of a sense of frustration with the ways in which the tools that I had learned over the course of my career in being a policy wonk, being a lawyer and an academic and someone who ran a think tank. Yes, I just closed my screen view. Does that help? Do you still see 2 of me? Okay. All right. Well, you'll figure it out. Okay, great. I wrote my book out of a sense that there had to be some reason why it is, as I say in the opening line of the book, we can't seem to have nice things in America. And by nice things, I don't mean, laundry that does itself. I mean nice things like really, truly guaranteed affordable health care for everyone from cradle to grave. I mean nice things like wages that keep workers out of poverty and a well-funded public school in every neighborhood, the kinds of things that our country should really be able to afford given our tremendous wealth, and that seem like the minimum standards of a decent life that have been so out of reach now for increasingly tens of millions of Americans in this age of inequality. And I spent a long time trying to answer that question through research, through data. And ultimately, it became clear to me that there was something else going on, something that people didn't really want to admit, which is that racism in our politics, in our policymaking, was ultimately behind so much of the dysfunction and the most vexing public problems in American life. And so I set out to test that hunch. I set out on a journey that would take me from California to Mississippi to Maine and back again multiple times, speaking to hundreds of people. And the journey really helped me realize 3 core insights. The first is that our collective progress is being held back by a lie, and that lie is the lie of the zero-sum racial hierarchy, the belief among many that there's sort of a fixed pie of well-being, and if one group gets a bigger slice and the other group must get a smaller slice. That zero-sum story is one that is sold by self-interested elites for their own profit, because it creates a sense of divide and conquer and competition. It undermines our sense of collective action and problem solving and the kinds of big gains in economic security that have only come through collective action, whether it's collective bargaining or the kinds of majority support that are needed for the kinds of public goods that really make sure we all have a decent standard of living and that our economy is thriving from the middle out and the bottom up. That zero-sum story is a racialized one because in the conception of the zero-sum, it's racial and ethnic groups who are competing. Now, as someone with an economic policy background, I know that that zero-sum is not true. In fact, the racial economic divide costs our society, and it makes sense, right? If you don't have all of your players on the field scoring points for your team, you're not going to score as many points. And you could really look at our economy like that, like a literal game. And you have people sidelined due to debt and discrimination and disadvantage. And so economists have calculated that the racial economic divide costs our U.S. economy $16 trillion over the past 20 years, according to one calculation of the black-white economic divide by Citigroup. And so this idea of the zero sum, that we're competing with one another, and is really wrong economically, and yet it's a popular story. It's a popular story, as I said, sold by elites for their own benefits, and it's a story that makes people believe that we're not all on the same team. So this zero-sum lie, when taken to its sort of logical conclusion in the real world, is one that led to really the source of the second big insight for me in the course of my journey, which is the story of what happened to many of this country's nearly 2,000 lavishly funded public swimming pools in America that used to exist as part of a building boom in the 1930s and 40s of public goods, things like libraries and roads and bridges and schools and parks and swimming pools. In my journey, I walked the grounds of what is known as Oak Park in Montgomery, Alabama, which has this sort of wide, flat expanse in the middle of it, where there used to be 1,000+ person swimming pool. And yet it was like so much of the infrastructure of public goods that was created in the 1930s and 40s that really helped to build the great American middle class, that ignited the American dream, that created the highest standard of living in the world in the 1950s. Like so much of those public goods, from Social Security to a massive investment in housing to the GI Bill to, strong labor laws, all of those public goods, the sense that government had a responsibility to ensure a decent standard of living, those public goods were largely segregated and for whites only. And so too was that public swimming pool, not just in Montgomery, Alabama, but in places in the North and the West and the Midwest, whether it was with a whites only sign or just by custom enforced through intimidation and violence. And when the civil rights movement allowed Black families to finally be able to successfully sue in the courts and advocate, saying, those are our tax dollars that have been funding those public goods all along as well. And in the case of the swimming pools, we want our kids to swim too. Many towns and cities across the country, including the one in Montgomery, Alabama, decided to drain their public pools rather than integrate them. And of course, that meant that draining the public pool, closing it. In Montgomery, they closed down the entire system of parks and recreation and kept it closed for a decade. All the parks in the city were closed rather than be integrated. That meant that everybody lost out on something. That meant that white families who weren't rich enough to build a backyard swimming pool or to join one of the fee-based private membership clubs that cropped up across the country in the wake of pool integration lost out. Of course, it meant, like so much of systemic racism, that Black and brown families never got to experience the kind of largesse of the public goods era in American policymaking that lasted between the 1930s and the civil rights movement. But it also meant that we, as an entire society, lost something when we stopped believing and supporting and investing in public goods and the public good. And as someone who really cares not so much about swimming pools, although I have a 3-year-old and I do appreciate a good swimming pool, but I care about the other kinds of public goods that helped create the scaffolding for the American dream, I really began to see how that drained pool politics, right? The idea that a public good was good in the eyes of many white Americans only in as much as it was reserved only for white people, only for parts of the public that they had been taught were good, not for the parts of the public that they had been taught to disdain and distrust. And so once a public good was integrated, support for the very idea of the public really fell, and it fell in our politics across the board. Today, you see a massive 60 percentage point differential if you are a white person with high levels of anti-Black sentiment, whether you support government spending at all, right? There's become a very high correlation between your views of government and your views about people of color. This inaccurate view that the majority of government spending goes to people of color has really colored many white Americans' views of government itself and the idea of collective action. And that really takes me to the third and final core concept in the book, and that's the idea of the solidarity dividend. And these are these gains that we can unlock, but only when we come together across lines of race. Because when it comes down to it, the most important things in society, the most important things in life, we just can't really accomplish on our own, right? I can recycle all I want. I can't stop global climate change on my own. I can tutor my child. I can't make sure that his neighborhood school is a high quality one, right? All of the things that really matter. I can, as most people who are paid, many people in this country, a third of American workers paid less than $15 an hour. They can each individually ask for a raise. They can't really raise the floor without collective action, either on the job or in terms of raising the minimum wage through government. And so it's really about coming together and really experiencing collective action that is going to help us refill the pool of the public good for everyone, that is going to help us really create the kind of America that our people deserve. And in a country as diverse as ours, where we've been sold the lie of racial hierarchy and the lie of racial distrust and division for so long, it's going to take cross-racial solidarity. And that's really the key. That's what I've been focusing the most on since the book came out, is just how is that happening across the country? Really understanding that those solidarity dividends are the way forward. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Ms. McGhee. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited to be here with you. My name is Nicole Benjamin, and I'm representing Westchester Women's Agenda. I'm also a fellow Yalie like you. Go Bulldogs. All right, so my first question for you is, can you share with us what are some ways white people can challenge that collective lie of zero-sum thinking?
Thank you. Thank you so much for being a moderator for this conversation. To all the people whose volunteerism has made this series of conversations and this community reading happen, I really just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Honestly, things like CURE, creating spaces for community conversation, creating ways to call people into a conversation about who we are to one another is one of the most important ways that we can come together. One of the most important ways that, in answer to your question, white people can challenge that zero-sum thinking. Because the thing about racism and the zero-sum thinking is that it creates division. It creates an alienation between yourself and your fellow human beings, and all of the ways in which we find common ground and a place to share story, right? Story, which is the touchstone of humanity. It's how we listen, it's how we understand ourselves, it's how we build community, it's how we evolve as a species, is through story. Ways that you find ways people creating ways to do that together, particularly across lines of race and in multiracial gatherings like this one, is really just a fundamental one. It's really interesting. I wrote the book over the course of 3.5 years or so. I finally stopped doing any edits and surrendered to my editor's pleas in November of 2020. And after that, it was very interesting to see people begin to speak about the Zerosum in very explicit ways. And the paperback, which came out about a month ago, I wrote an afterword, which talks about sort of what happened after the publication of the book and how many people in politics, including the President Biden, began to really call out the Zerosum. And I was really intrigued by that. It's sort of like, okay, what is the effect of just saying it plain, right? That some people have been sold this lie of the Zerosum. And what I've learned in conversations with people is that actually just naming it, saying, you know what, there is this Zerosum belief, it's being sold to many by people who are really self-interested, and it's being sold for their own profit, that's a helpful sort of conversation starter, because in some ways you have all these buried subterranean narratives in our society, and when you unearth them and you look at them for what they are, you can begin to see the flaws in that thinking. But if they're allowed to just sort of be under the soil and germinate, there's no way to really uproot them. You don't face them.
Hello, Ms. McGhee. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm Girandi Martinez, and I lead a community-based organization that really empowers new immigrants and low-income families. But as someone who identifies as Latina, this question always comes up in my brain and in my head and my heart. And I really would love for some of your thoughts on this, because you mentioned one group versus the other. That's not what it's about. So when we talk about the solidarity dividend, how important is it for Black and Brown communities to come together? It seems that there's some trust and healing that needs to be built after generations of harm and misinformation about one another, especially in relationships between Black and Latinx communities. Is this addressed in truth, racial healing, and reconciliation process?
Yeah, thank you so much for your work and for that question, because it is really important. So often people can interpret the idea of cross-racial solidarity as just meaning, between white folks and a monolith of people of color, but that's not actually the way we live our lives. That's not the way our communities are shaped. I'm here zooming in from California, a state that reached quote-unquote majority minority a long time ago, and yet the solidarity that often needs to be built in community, the political coalitions that need to be created in order to address some of the big challenges that the states faces, are Black and Brown, are among different communities of color. And so this is really the question, right? If the more you learn about the history of racial formation, right? Remember that race, as we live it, describe it today, is a social construct, right? There is no biological basis for the idea that we are actually different races. There is just the one human race, and yet our phenotype, the way we look, our skin color, our hair texture, has been used across history to create massive disparities in how we live and what our social and economic position is. And those categories, those racial categories, change and bend and warp all the time. And so when you realize that this sort of catch-all category of white used to include very ethnic people, I was reminded, I was watching some Ukrainian dance the other day, as part of a special that I was watching about the Ukrainian people, given the incredible tragedy that's going on right now. And I was looking at their dance and their costumes, and I was like, these people, in a generation in where I grew up in Chicago, became quote unquote white, but like, you would never sort of just categorize them and flatten their identity in that way, right? There's just an enormous amount of real specificity and ethnic culture. And if you think about the way in which the lie of white supremacy, and I'm really always, I try to remember not to just use the phrase white supremacy in a way that sort of reifies the idea that there is any kind of supremacy in whiteness, but rather say the lie of white supremacy. One thing the lie of white supremacy does is, in order to maintain sort of numerical power, it draws in more people, right? And so people who generations ago would have been considered quite ethnic and specific in their culture have been invited to assimilate in the United States. And that is a question that is still unanswered about many of the people that are today seen as Latinx, many of the people who identify as white Hispanic, right, on the census, who don't think of themselves as a race, don't think of themselves as necessarily people of color. And that question of what is the path going to be for tens of millions of people who right now are somewhere in between the poles of white and black in the American racial social construct, is really a question about solidarity or hierarchy, right? It's a question about whether or not the anti-black beliefs and stereotypes that have so often been marketed to new immigrants and to communities of color who are not black in the United States are going to be things that provide the kind of feeling of status and zero sum that it has for generations of different new Americans. And then on the flip side, I would say that one of the ways that the people in the ruling elite have been able to break the potential bonds of cross-racial solidarity, black and brown, is by selling the lie that brown people are stealing the jobs of black people, right? Creating that narrative about job competition, which has sort of been, as I write about in the book, one of the main cudgels. And the only people who are really only ever benefiting from that narrative about job competition are the people who are benefiting financially in our very unequal society. And so what is it going to take? I think it's going to take organizations at the grassroots level and on the ground level really creating opportunities for cross-cultural dialogue. I mean, we simply don't have enough ways for ordinary people who spend far too many hours of their days and weeks working to get to know one another across lines of race. And if you do that intentionally in brown and black communities, as we've seen, and I've really been focusing on studying, those kinds of organizations and those kind of community spaces, it can create just a tremendous amount of trust and really the backbone for the kind of strength that communities need to really solve big problems together.
Dr. McGhee, Professor McGhee, I just want to acknowledge how incredible I think your book is personally. I'm not as accomplished of a researcher, but I'm a researcher all the same. So I'm looking at the zero-sum game framework being based against the model of the solidarity dividend as a solution. And in my organization, we try to focus on making data-driven decisions and having evidence-based practices as a proper researcher should when they're bringing that into their organizational strategy. So I want to dig into the concept of the solidarity dividend and different types of solidarity. And I'd like to understand what we mean and define the zero-sum game and whether it's natural or artificial, and if that matters. So my question is the relationship between rich whites and poor whites codependent? Aren't poor whites signaling to rich whites that they will support the policies of rich whites when they manufacture scarcity, that zero sum, that artificial zero sum, as long as rich whites signal that the only trickle down will go to poor whites and not other groups. And I like your analogy of the pool. So is it that if we give out a pool, it would only be your pool, your school, your home, your jobs, your healthcare? So that's my question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for that question. And I think you articulated it very, very well. That really is the crux of it. That's been this sort of old racial bargain. In the chapter, No One Fights Alone, where I write about the way in which, in the sort of economic order, wealthy white elites who are self-interested have really created, since before the founding of our country, a racial bargain that said, don't side with your class, right? Other folks who are struggling, who are landless, who are working for poverty wages, but rather side with your color. And in exchange for sort of defending the system, the unequal system that keeps those elites who are offering that bargain in power, we will give you what one of my great heroes, W.B. Du Bois, called the wages of whiteness, sort of a psychological wage instead of a material wage, so that you will still be in poverty, but you will feel that you are higher up on a ladder of human hierarchy, and that you have certain elements of status, right? And, under Jim Crow, that was being, really seen as a citizen when Black and brown and indigenous people were not. But in today's society, that is sort of the kind of crumbs of a little bit better standard of living often. We know this when we see in the data that the average white high school dropout has greater household wealth than the average, sorry, 1 second. I'm in a hotel room because I'm in California. Hold on 1 second. Okay. The average white high school dropout has less wealth. I'm sorry. The average white high school dropout has more wealth, more household wealth than the average Black college graduate, right? So you see that there is a material benefit because of the compounding effect of racial exclusion from those policies that helped to create the middle class in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And yet, ultimately, we still have massive inequality, and we still don't have the kinds of guarantees of a decent standard of living, guaranteed real retirement security beyond the meager subsistence of Social Security, guaranteed universal health care for working class people who often fall in that Medicaid coverage gap. We don't have guaranteed paid family leave or child care. College has become unaffordable. We don't have free college. We don't have the guarantee of a well-funded and excellent public school in every neighborhood, or mass transit, affordable transit options in our communities. These are the things that, frankly, less diverse societies that are industrialized and our economic peers give to their citizens without question. And there's a certain sort of level of the floor that is higher. And yet when you look at what is the politics that creates that tolerance for such inequality in our society, right? Where nearly half of adult workers are paid too little to meet their basic needs, right? While we have the billionaires gaining $1.7 trillion more during the pandemic. We have some of our industries having 1,000-to-1 average CEO to worker pay gap, right? We have so much tolerance for that level of inequality, and so much of it, the political science says, has to do with racial resentment, with this sense that as one of the workers that I talked to in Mississippi, a white worker said, there's this feeling in the plant that as long as the whites are in charge, I'm in charge. And that that racial bargain is one where I think as inequality has grown and economic insecurity has increased over the past 50 years, the benefits of that racial bargain are getting slimmer and slimmer. And so the opportunities for real solidarity across lines of race, seeing common problems and making common solutions is growing.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm the Reverend Tammy Burks, and I am the priest at St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Mamaroneck, New York. And I'd like to echo thank you so much for being here. And thank you for writing a book that is accessible to people whose brains are not data-driven. I certainly count myself in that category, but found it so accessible. And part of that was your storytelling that you wove in and out of all of the chapters. Specifically, you have some beautiful stories of communities that came together across racial lines to work for a common good. However, it seems to me that moving white people to cross those lines and take the kind of risks that are necessary requires a common identified problem or issue. So how do we, in a community such as ours, where we have such great socioeconomic divides that primarily are among racial lines, how do we move people from what we see as wonderful works of charity to fighting for equity? Is there a way that we can do that so that fundamental lasting change that benefits all actually occurs? Another way of putting this might be kind of bluntly, how do we get rich white people to understand the benefits of inclusion and equity for all people, and that it's not just a vehicle for making them feel good about themselves?
Thank you so much for your question, Reverend Tammy.
You're welcome.
It's multifaceted, multifaceted indeed.
It's complicated.
So I think there are a number of levels, right? One is I tried to, throw the kitchen sink in the book in some ways, right? One is I really tried to make the economic case, because for some people, particularly within the kind of business elite, it really does require an economic case, right? They've been taught for so long that it's really about the numbers. It's really about the economic benefits and the costs and benefits, that I wanted to try to put enough data in there and make enough of a mutual benefit argument that for many business leaders, the book has, worked to be influential to that part of their brains, right? And I've been surprised at how much it's been kind of a business book, right? It's I definitely didn't think of it as a business book when I was writing it. In fact, as I looked back, as it was, as I was reading to revise, because it is really true when they say that writing is rewriting, right? As I was reading the book over and over again, the manuscript to revise it, I realized that the only consistent bad guys, the only consistent villains in the stories were corporations, right? And the corporations I named, right? Nissan and Chevron and the fast food companies and all the banks, right? Like those were the bad guys. And yet the book was awarded this big business book prize, right? It's the best business book of the year. And there have been all these corporations that have had it be required reading. And that to me says that there was something about foregrounding the economics and saying, foregrounding the idea of the racial zero sum costing our economy, and really going at one of the core kind of myths that sometimes predominates in business, which is the zero sum, and saying that it's not true was useful, right? Created some sort of impact for people who've seen the world that way. And everybody wants to see that there's a win-win, right? But then, as you said, I do think that most of us human beings, and even those human beings who are kind of educated and conditioned to see the world through data and through a kind of economic or financial model, also really resonate with stories. And I do, right? And so I wanted to include the stories of people who had gained or lost, because of either racism in our politics and policymaking, or acts of real cross-racial solidarity, and hope that stories of people like Bridget Hughes, the white fast food worker who really shifted in her mentality through organizing, to as she said to me, I used to think it was about, for us to come up, they've got to, be down. But now I see that as long as we're divided, we're conquered, right? For her story is one that has been really resonant with people. But ultimately, as I did feel like in the end I had to include a chapter about the moral and spiritual costs, because there is a level at which you can make the case, you can, share the examples, but fundamentally, there is, I think, within all of us, a deep sense, a voice that is only as loud as we allow, as we get quiet enough to hear it, and as we allow it to be heard, that says that there's something just wrong about a society that is so unequal and so divided. And so that's where I look to people like you, Reverend Tammy, right? To people like you to be able to really communicate the moral imperative, which is not about making yourself feel good, but is about knowing what is the purpose of your time on this earth, right? Is it to collect more and more things, or is it to leave this planet better than when you found it, right? The idea that that service is the rent, right, that we pay, but that real service has to understand what is the cause of the poverty, the homelessness, the hunger, whatever it is. And once you really understand the cause of the manifestation of sickness that you're seeing in the, food pantries or in the shelters, that just handing out a blanket and food is not enough. Right? If you want to have impact, and most wealthy people are used to having a whole lot of impact, that they have to do more than just write a check to a charity, that they've got to really understand the ways in which our housing policies, our policies around labor, our social safety nets, our tax policies are creating the outcomes that they are seeing at the very tail end, showing up in people having need in the richest country.
Thank you.
So, Ms. McGhee, our next question is, how have you seen the concept of the solidarity dividend taken up by corporate America and our government? I know we have some evidence of it in government with the recent formation of a coalition of mayors for guaranteed income. So are there any other examples that you can give?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned before, the book came out February of 2021, and by June, my editor was saying we want to see new material for the paperback, and I was appalled. I was like, I just finished writing this book. Why should I have to write more? I was so annoyed. I dragged my feet on the deadline. I was like, I'm still, doing event after event every day. And I'm like, what? I have to write more? What am I going to update this thing every 6 months? This is not a blog post. Like, what is going on? What do you want of me? I was so annoyed. But, in August, when things died down a little bit, I finally did, sit and think, okay, what else do I have to say about this book that I just finished writing less than a year ago? And ultimately, when I turned on that blank page, there was a lot, right? A lot had happened between November 2020. And much of it had to do with implementation of the solidarity dividend concept, right? The whole year of 2021 we had the lowest level of poverty that we've ever had on record. And how did we get that? Right? That came through a massive upswell in a spirit of interconnectedness and solidarity, and a sort of bursting through the dam of anti-government. The only thing we can do in government is tax cuts for the wealthy. That was busted open by the pandemic and by the stimulus, and then of course the American Rescue Plan, which included just a massive refilling of the pool of public goods, just an enormous amount of bipartisan, in terms of out in the country, not people who are paid to be partisan, but just ordinary folks. The American Rescue Plan had 70-80% support. And it created a whole number of public goods that helped to buoy the economy, that helped to address the pandemic. We had the child tax credit, of course, which was this massive public good that just was out of a simple recognition that it costs a lot to raise a family, and that families need help. We had all of these things that I really saw as coming from a multiracial coalition that, voted a certain way in November to create the majority that passed the American Rescue Plan. But then also, when you looked at who supported it, it was a multiracial majority of Americans. And it had been a long time since that kind of expansion of public goods and of government had multiracial majority support. And so I really saw all of that as solidarity dividends. I think you've seen throughout the country in, things that would have been considered unthinkable. The foreclosure and eviction moratoriums, the massive rental assistance that has been created, the expansion of pre-K and 3K at the state and local level, more incidences of raising the minimum wage. There have just been so many ways in which the kinds of solutions that just say, no, we are not going to allow a certain level of suffering. And yes, we believe that everybody is basically doing their very best to try to survive, and we're not going to punish people who are struggling anymore. That spirit has been a part of our common discourse in the past year or two in a way that it had not been for 40. And we saw a massive expansion of the social safety net. And so I do think of all of those as solidarity dividends.
My apologies. I saw a comment when I just last spoke that said I didn't introduce myself. So my name is Shane Oceanloye. I'm a small business consultant. I have a firm, Singularity, in Rochelle. We also launched, I'm a co-founder of a nonprofit, Urban Legacy, and our mission is to build Black wealth. And my apologies for not introducing myself. I have a tendency to just get straight to the questions in the word. So my apologies. And that's actually something that I loved about your book. I liked your book as I read it and completed it, and your structure was incredible for introducing a problem, telling a deeply personal story that grabs the people that are very emotional, and that's not a problem. And then getting to people like me who are more data-driven, and I want to see, well, what are the case studies for this solidarity dividend that you're talking about? And then I fell in love with your book when I went to the end, and it had all the citations in the back, and I was just like, this is incredible. So thank you so much for that. But even in telling the story, you talked about touching the root when you outlined your book. And I have a doctor friend who does work in implicit bias, solving the implicit bias problem in healthcare. And he was on a panel that was similar to this one, and he was appalled. He's an older white gentleman. He came to me and he told me he was appalled because one of his cohorts said, well, we don't want to accuse doctors of being individually racist. The system might be racist. That's fine. The institution might be racist. And he said, but Shane, we've seen the research that says this is how first-year medical students think. This is how fourth years think. This is how they think when so we know that these are individuals that are out there committing these infractions. And my question is, well, when Republicans say that corporations are people, we cringe. But when we exclusively focus on institutional racism, instead of the individuals running those organizations, aren't we saying the same thing? A corporation by definition is a group of people. So how can an institution be racist without the people in it being racist, or at the very least upholding the racism? And that goes for policy, corporations, government departments, the rich. Isn't focusing on that and those larger institutions a form of disassociation for the purpose of absolving individuals who are actually being racist on a daily basis?
Yeah. Great point. Thank you. And thank you for the work that you do. You know, I am, in some ways, my transition from working exclusively in public policy to try to use the medium of a book to reach people on an individual level was really out of a sense that it wasn't enough just to see structures and institutions and policies as the problem. Because, of course, it is individual worldviews and beliefs that support those structures and policies, that tolerate them, that vote for them, right? That cheer them on, right? And so I think it is, you know, my decision to say, okay, I'm going to leave what in many ways was my dream job, running a think tank that I was hired as an entry-level staffer at, and write a book, write my first book. It was a bet that there was something to be said for trying to reach individuals in a very intimate medium, right? A book, you know, this is great. Everybody's reading it together and discussing, but ultimately, like, you're reading it by yourself, right? You know, you're reading it by yourself. If you're reading it, you know, if you're reading the print version, you're taking the words that are on the page and putting them in your own inner voice, right? So you're like reading to yourself, and it really is. It's just a very intimate sort of each one way to try to shift consciousness. And I think that I chose to do that out of a sense that it was necessary for us to create a consciousness shift in individuals, in often powerful individuals, right? And then in individuals who may not have, you know, pen signing powerful, pen signing power on an individual level, but who are powerful in their communities, are powerful in their families, are the kinds of people who can change the minds of their neighbors and their coworkers. And so I really do agree with the premise. I disagree with the premise of the person on the panel, with your doctor friend. I really do agree that it's a both and, that ultimately policies and laws are supported and encouraged and tolerated by individuals who have a set of belief systems. We've seen how, you know, powerful individuals can shape consciousness on a mass scale, whether it's Putin or Trump or, you know, I mean, we've really seen how what we believe, the stories that we consume about one another, create mass consciousness. And frankly, I will go out on a limb here and say that's part of why, when you look at the very well-funded and well-organized backlash against the movement for racial justice, the movements for racial justice across this country in every community, those movements, you see that what the backlash is fighting is not really law and policy change, but it's consciousness. It's trying to say, let's not talk about this. Let's not learn this. Let's attack our children's freedom to learn. Let's intimidate people from using the word equity or saying the word gay, right? This is about our minds and our hearts. And so we really are in a battle for the hearts and minds of Americans. Do we see ourselves in one another? Or do we believe the worst about one another? Do we fear one another, or do we trust one another? And so, you know, as is often the case, the sort of entrenched powers that be often attack the most powerful weapon that the people have. And so they're attacking the very idea of the mass consciousness raising and individual enlightenment that has been happening over the past number of years.
Sorry. Thank you for answering hard questions, and you are officially my favorite author.
Thank you, Jamie. It's very kind.
Wow, amazing. I would love to just take this moment to bring it a little bit back home because we are in Westchester County, a community that's enormously affluent, one of the richest counties in the state of New York. And yet at the Community Resource Center, a nonprofit organization that I lead, we've had to partner with other similar organizations across the county to build labor alliances to protect immigrant workers. Because in Westchester County, wage theft is rampant, even today. So can you speak to how economically detrimental it is for employers to not pay employee wages based on immigration status? How does it apply when looking at the issue from a solidarity dividend and an economic perspective? Labor laws are not being adhered to in New York State and across the country. How does this hurt all of us?
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad you asked that question. I'm so glad you're doing that work. It's really important. When I was president of Demos, we issued a report. My amazing colleague, Amy Traub, a researcher, did a report about wage theft, right? Seeing how much of an issue it is across our entire country. Someone's going to come in one more time. No, maybe not. And really making the case, a few really startling facts that Amy uncovered. One is that just looking in the retail sector, just, one of the largest sectors of the economy, certainly was more so before the pandemic, but of course now it's just moved online. You have all of this efforts that employers make to combat shoplifting, right? This entire kind of system of inventory tracking and policing and all of that. But in fact, retail employers steal their employees' wages as much as the sort of total wage theft in retail is the same as the shoplifting theft that retailers report every year, right? And so the cheating of wages, whether it's because of the impunity of immigration status, because it's the impunity that's offered because we have so few labor inspectors and people who are on the side of workers, creating any accountability for employers, is a huge problem. And then the Department of Labor looked at just New York and California, 2 states, and found that because of minimum wage violations, which is another way of talking about wage theft, or one aspect of wage theft where people are just paid less than the minimum wage, in just New York and California, in 1 year, there was about $300 million in lost payroll tax revenue and about $100 million in lost federal income tax revenue in those 2 states, right? So this is something that is draining the pool of our public resources when we don't have that revenue from people being able to be paid, what they deserve. And so that really is, for me, this impacts us all, not to mention the statistics that are so often trotted out when you talk about what the impacts to entire communities are of poverty, the need to rely on government assistance in order to feed your family, all of that. I think when we look at the whole picture of that between the lost tax revenue and the social services that are needed to make up for it, while we have oftentimes extremely profitable employers skirting the law and cheating with impunity, we can really see that enforcing the law, raising the floor, addressing the scourge of poverty work is really beneficial to all of us.
This has been incredible. We had one other question from Tammy, but it is 3:00 and we want to open it up to our virtual audience and our in-person audience. We also had registrants send questions because everybody's so excited about connecting with you, Ms. McGhee. So do we have anyone live right now who has a burning question? Okay, right here. You can, yeah, there's a microphone coming around and actually she can see you up there. You could look up there over the clock.
Up there? Oh, hi.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi. I have sort of like a chapter 7 specific question.
Okay.
For anyone who didn't read the book, that was the one on housing segregation and education segregation. It's a slightly 2-part, but it's pretty quick. So do you think that the solidarity dividend can help be created by white upper middle class families choosing to live in towns where their children would attend schools where the white children are in the minority, instead of avoiding or fleeing those communities? And can you explain that argument? And then the second part of that would be, how would you convince a white upper middle class family? How would you convince a white upper middle class family moving, say, to Westchester County, where to live, not only so that they can participate in the solidarity dividend? All right, maybe someone doesn't like that question, but also that they should participate in that dividend.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your question. I heard it loud and clear. Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. That chapter is called Living Apart. And it's one that, has gotten a lot of, there's been a lot of conversations about it. So, to the first part of your question, I'm not someone who's going to, everyone has to make this choice for themselves. And I'm not someone who's going to say, I'm not going to say that you're only a good person if you do X, Y, and Z in terms of your choice of schooling and where you live, right? I'm not going to do that. But I did include stories in the chapter of white and, in the case of Ali Takata and her family, white adjacent families who did really see the benefit for themselves and their children of being in schools that reflected the global majority and that were outside of the kind of resource hoarding of the white segregated schools that they were really all kinds of things were marketing and trying to pull them into, right? I'm sure that there are many examples of those kinds of schools and school districts in Westchester. So I included in the chapter evidence from, scholars who focus on the quality and outcomes of public education, who have found that it is really good. It's a demonstrable cognitive good for students to learn among diverse peers, and for that diversity creates a positive benefit in education around critical thinking and empathy, that diverse groups solve problems better, that children who learn in educational settings that are racially and ethnically diverse have a whole bunch of improved outcomes, and that is something that you have to make an active choice if you are a wealthier white family often to choose, because of the way that our school systems are so segregated and because of the injustice of the way that property values track investment in public goods and public schools. So how would you convince someone? I'm not an expert in that. I was sort of never a K through 12 education expert. But there is a group called Integrated Schools that is a community of parents and educators who really have figured out kind of how to create a community of support around parents who choose integrated schools. And there's, a big Facebook group, there's a podcast, and they really are an amazing, sort of racial equity organization that really focuses on this, one of the most kind of important and personal choices that families make around where they live and who their children go to school with. And so I'd really, recommend that folks who are interested in this question join that Facebook group. And they're just really good about, people volunteering to, have a phone call with you and just really create a support system for people who want to change the system one child at a time. And then in terms of the just overall appeal of, if you join the Westchester County community, can you work for a solidarity dividend? I think we need to make those opportunities really clear and communicate about the concept in ways that maybe folks don't have to read a 400-page book with lots of footnotes in order to really understand what the opportunities for being part of a solidarity dividend are. I think there's an enormous amount of goodwill and values alignment and enthusiasm among people across different backgrounds right now in this country to do the right thing. And a lot of what is needed is organization and to use a kind of corporate word here, marketing of these opportunities to people to know that this is a way that they can get involved in their community. This is a way that they can be on the right side of certain big issues around housing or school funding or taxes, and what the solidarity dividend rationale is. Thank you for your question. Thank you for reading.
Pam, do you have a chat question?
There's a live question.
We do want to make sure we give the folks that are virtual a chance to ask questions as well. So I have one here from the chat, which is, have you had this conversation with high school students, and what have you found resonates well with them?
Really, 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 really good question. So I've had a lot of high school conversations. The chapters that resonate the most with them have been the Living Apart and the Same Sky chapter. So obviously talking about, the things that's very real to them, which is where they go to K through 12 schools. And then the thing that's very real to them, which is climate change. And, if there's one issue that for most young people feels like the most glaring example of drain pool politics, of our inability to come together to solve big challenges, and the costs of the anti-government sentiment in our politics, it's our refusal to really do what's fully necessary to address climate change. So those have been the parts that have been really resonant. I just this past week sent in the edits on an adaptation of my book for young readers, which is just kind of a dream come true. The idea that students at the middle school, junior high school level will have a version of the book that they can read. I found that high school students are reading the adult version, and it's been really, picked up in colleges as sort of first year reads as well. But I'm really thrilled about the young reader version, which is sort of a junior high version. And that'll be out probably in 2023 from Random House Children's Books.
Another live question. Oh, above the clock. Above the clock? Yes.
Can you see me? Can you see me?
I can't see you yet, but I can hear you, so go ahead and ask the question.
I want you to see my shirt. I use my shirt.
Come into the middle.
Okay.
Oh, there you are. Hi, look at you. What a great shirt.
Hi, beautiful lady. I just wanted you to see my shirt. I'm born African American because I was born here. But, I wear this from time to time because this is who I am also. My statement is, first, I'm just going to really try to talk really quickly. Forgive me if I get a little, because when I'm passionate, my words get jumbled. I'm from a very large family. My mom has 13 brothers and sisters with her father and mother who were married. Grandpa had extra, so he had ended up having 30 children. So we have so many cousins and so many aunts and so many uncles. And it's just like a lot of other people. We love each other. We try not to get on each other's nerves or whatever. So we're like a community within the community of the world, so to speak. And just recently, my little nephew you know, again, I'm born American, African American. We were walking down the street and he started saluting the flags, that the American flags that were, you know, out the street. And I had to tell him, you know, the nicest possible way that I possibly could, little man, we're taking a knee right now. And the reason we're taking a knee is because until the government or the American, you know, system do right by us, we have to protest. This is our form of protest. He's 8 years old and he got it. He got it. And I'm just so happy that he got it. It's a shame that we have to do these things, but we have to do these things in these times. And I just wanted to add also, Martin Luther King made a statement. And one of his quotes was, when you teach, you know, when you teach the world to degrade Black people and you teach the world to uplift white people, you're doing everybody an injustice because you're lying and lies cause problems. So, you know, I just want you to elaborate on that if you heard that quote, because that is a famous quote. I may not have quoted it exactly the way it's supposed to be, but I know what it means, okay? Thank you for listening and God bless you. Keep doing it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sis. Thank you. Well, that's a really brave and wonderful thing that you did in the middle of the street with your son. And I'm sure, you know, many of the your nephew, many of the passersby watched that and saw that. And I think, you know, that dual consciousness of both being proud of this country and proud to be a part of this country and knowing that so much that our people have sacrificed to create this country is a debt that's not yet been repaid. I think that is a really, really, really important lesson to learn. I mean, I think your nephew learns that lesson, you know, from his school, from what he sees in the media and on the internet, and for you as an elder to him to really put it into context, I think is really important and brave. I named my son in part after Dr. King. He is absolutely one of my heroes, not from the silly sort of whitewashed version of him, but from the much more radical parts of his teaching. And he really said that segregation harms us all, and that when you organize a society based on a lie, only dysfunction can flow. And that's really, in some ways, I dedicate the book to my mother, but his teachings, guide probably every word through my book, because he really did understand on a moral and economic sense how fundamentally we are interconnected, right? And there are so many beautiful quotations of his that speak to, how our fates are intertwined. And if more people believed and understood that, I think we would be in a much better place, without a doubt.
Okay. Yeah, that's okay. We have time, yeah.
On how to really get people to have more difficult conversations, to understand each other, and to see what we see.
So we can't hear the questioner right now.
Oh, okay. Maybe put it closer,
Okay.
yeah. Keep the mic close.
No. Is this any better?
It's a little better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Keep it close and raise your voice, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
We're not.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to know, what are the strategies that work best to have those difficult conversations? If there are groups that you've heard of that have really done the work and have the results of people coming together, seeing they have a problem and they'd like to solve it. I don't want people just to necessarily feel bad. I want them to fix things.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I do understand. I think we are all feeling like, the time is now for action. So there are a bunch of groups. In fact, someone in the chat, I haven't been able to see all the things in the chat, but from time to time I take a quick look. One of the most recent comments was from someone who's with Surge Westchester County. Surge is standing up for racial justice, which is an organization where, particularly where white people can come together to have these hard conversations amongst themselves and to make commitments for collective action. I think that's really, really important. There is an online-based group called Hard Conversations that does that, and I would hope and think that that would hopefully be an outcome of this process of what Cure does and of these community conversations where people who have read the book together can sign up to take action together. I mean, one of the questions I get very often is, in 2020, we had 30 million people in the streets. It was obviously this huge moment of collective action and social protest, but what's going on right now? And from my journeys across the country over the past 2 years, what I've seen is that people have really taken it home. They've said, okay, I may not be able to do something at the national level, but I can address the issue of housing in my community. I can address how schools are funded. I can address where this new toxic incinerator is going to be sited. I can address things as simple as how, public parks and pools and recreation are funded equitably across our county. And that only takes 5, 10, even 3 really determined people coming together and organizing in their spare time. And so if I can do anything to sort of communicate from what I'm learning, is that it really doesn't take very many people getting to get together to make a big, big difference.
Anybody in the house here, or do we have a virtual question?
I think we have a lot of questions in the chat, but I can't tell.
Yeah.
We have one from the chat right now, which is, can you explain how to get equity for Black Americans, descendants of the enslaved? That will be fair, since these Americans have suffered the longest and are the most traumatized.
This is a question about reparations. I'm in full support of reparations for the descendants of slavery. I am in full support of reparations that is not exclusively about enslavement, but is about the, as I study what has had the most significant economic impact to people alive today, it has really been about the 20th century exclusion from those structures that helped to create the middle class, whether it's the GI Bill, the Social Security Act, and most importantly, intergenerational housing wealth. If you only look at the 20th century, we are talking about, an average of probably $100,000 per household in lost wealth that can be directly tied to the racist policies of the 20th century. And so I think it's really important. I think it's really important for us to talk about that period of time. I think that's actually sort of a bigger case to be made, and it's both a bigger case economically, I think, and it's also maybe politically an easier case because we've still got many people alive who remember that, and it doesn't, and many of the people who it's just a story that doesn't feel like ancient history, right? It feels like this is when the house that I live in was created and funded, right? This is, we know the stories of these communities that were redlined. We still live in them, right? So I think it's really important. And as I write in the book, I don't see that reparations is a zero sum, right? It's not going to be the government knocking on the doors of white families and saying, cut a check to the Black family down the street. It's really about the government, which was the one that created these policies and this unfairness, and that collected tax dollars from Black families without, while excluding them from many of the public benefits for generations, needs to be the ones to create reparations, and that this is not something that white people should fear, or anybody else who's not African American should fear. That as we know, when Black people are given a little bit of a shot, we create a moon landing, right? We create just an extraordinary benefit. And so I really see reparations as seed capital for the nation that we're becoming, and that if more families have the kinds of cushion of household wealth that even, lower income white families can sort of depend on, home equity, stocks and bonds, we will have a much more vibrant and thriving economy for all of us.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So we've got, the chat is on fire. There's a lot of really, really great questions, but a few have come in on the topic of CRT or anti-CRT. And this one here, in the context of K through 12 education that is reeling with an anti-CRT backlash, what changes would you suggest to ensure that public school educators aren't replicating or reinforcing the beliefs that keep us apart instead of together?
This is a heartbreaking part of the past year. There's been such an important movement across the country of just educators recognizing that we still don't have enough diversity in the teaching ranks, and that first experience of authority that so many children of color have is one that is shot through with unconscious bias and discrimination and ignorance about the real full history of this country. And so, there has been really amazing work around social and emotional learning, around training teachers to understand bias, around training teachers in better curricula. I mean, the curricula in our country is abysmal, right? I mean, we are mis and undereducated by on purpose. And by design. And so that work is really important. And what is happening now, and there's a lot of good articles sort of showing, the sort of funding roots of where this sudden sort of made up panic about critical race theory is coming from, and how it really is a very partisan secretive donor network that is making this happen in schools across the country. At a time which is very, very cynical, when public schools and educators are really at their wits' end in the pandemic. It's really, in my mind, it's trying to drive a zero-sum story of it's either American history or Black history, right? It's trying to perpetuate a drained pool, where it's really it's about scaring white parents away from public integrated education. We've heard from Republicans in Congress that they have a goal of, tripling the number of people who are homeschooled. And sure, for homeschooling, but what are we really talking about here? We're talking about severing the fibers of connection that create for an integrated citizenry who understands one another, who has a common set of facts about the world, and creating little atomized houses of disinformation and distrust. And that's very, very dangerous. And I think each and every one of us needs to speak out in defense of our children's freedom to learn, and in defense of accurate history. And we need to not leave this just to the educators, right? Because the educators and the librarians are on the front lines of these fights, and it's up to all of us as parents, as business leaders, as faith leaders in community to say, this is an extremely dangerous thing. We know who bans books. We know who is afraid of the truth, and it is un-American, and we won't stand for it.
Okay, we have time for one more, and then I'm going to wrap up my comments as quickly as possible. So where are we generating that question from?
We have one that has been submitted by a virtual audience member, which is, What is your opinion about the ability of the U.S. to become a pluralistic democracy and to right the wrongs of the past when we are in a very polarized political climate and a climate where facts and truth seem optional to many?
Thank you for asking that question. It's a question I get a lot. I am still hopeful. I am still hopeful because of gatherings like this and all of the organizations and civic infrastructure that supported it and that made sure that a book that is both, popular and appealing and mainstream and quite radical at its core and in its message of cross-racial solidarity, made it into the hands of so many people in Westchester County. I am hopeful because I really do see that across the country, despite the headlines, right, we have a little bit of a sort of rubbernecking thing that goes on in our media, right, where we are drawn to the most antisocial, the most outlandish, the most outrageous thing, right? We have to see it. We have to ogle it. We can't look away. And yet on so many of the issues that are seen as quote unquote divisive, they're not actually split down the middle, right? Masking and vaccines, 70% support when it's necessary and needed, right? Even this issue about what we teach in our schools, 88% of the country thinks we need to teach both the negative parts of our history and the positive parts of our history. And in states like Iowa, where it was passed by a partisan legislature, it was not popular with the majority of the citizens in that extremely white state. So in some ways, one of the ways in which the radical sort of antisocial, anti-collective fringe tries to, aggrandize its power is to make us pay attention to it, to use the propagandistic forces in our media to amplify their message, to make us feel like, we have less power and fewer numbers than we do. Even the sort of the kind of discourse about Republicans and Democrats makes it seem like they're, equally divided among the country in numbers, and they're not, right? And so we've really got to remember that people like this who are curious, open, willing to face the problems in our society and in our communities and address them head on, willing to be curious about one another and humble about how we have been taught to distrust one another, how our history lessons in schools have mostly disserved us, how our media stereotypes have mostly polluted our imaginations about one another. People who are willing to be open and to grow and to learn have always been an important force in our society and has never been bigger than it is today. And so despite all the disinformation and misinformation and all the amplification of division, ultimately, the people in this conversation today are who are going to shape our common future. And so I'm grateful just to be a part of it. And I want to thank you all again so very much for this conversation, for reading the book, for engaging with the ideas, for asking hard questions, for volunteering, for spending your Sunday afternoon in an intellectual conversation when you could be gardening or watching TV. It really means so very much to me.
So I'm gonna, can somebody put my mic on? Oh, thanks. I'm gonna just take 2 minutes to wrap up. First, Miss Heather McGhee, you are as brilliant and compassionate and generous as your book. So that was really amazing. I appreciate you for beaming in today. I want to thank everyone, the 5 libraries, the Board of Legislators, all of our partners throughout the county. Please check out Otilia's Humble Bumble outside, the virtual bookshop. That will someday be a brick and mortar bookshop here in New Rochelle. She has beautiful things. Our moderators, Gerandi, Shane, Reverend Tammy, and Nicole, thank you so much for your generosity. All of you for coming out. Cure can't have these free events, without your support. So if you're in a position to donate, please do. We need volunteers, so please contact me, Nicole@learnwithcure.com, if you'd like to work with us. And the good news is, with all these questions, there's no need to invent the wheel. We have tons of organizations throughout the county that are working on unbelievable things toward equity, toward anti-racism, toward creating the world that we want, and you don't have to do it at home by yourself. It's happening. So we will send out resources. We will make sure we put out Ms. McGhee's resources, and I thank you so much for just for you and for this community. Thank you.